Hey gang, Stephen Marshall, kylandlordlaw.com, and I wanted to address an issue today that I've been getting lots of calls and emails about, and that is surrender, abandonment, and when you can take over a unit without having to go through the eviction process. And there's part of the Uniform Residential Landlord Tenant Act, KRS 383.690. And I'm just going to read it to you. It says that a landlord may not recover or take possession of a dwelling unit by action or otherwise, including the willful diminution of services to the tenant by interrupting or causing the interruption of heat, electric, running water, hot water, gas, or other essential service to the tenant, except in the case of abandonment, surrender, or as otherwise permitted by law. So, what all those words tell us is that really the only way that you can take possession of a unit legally is when the tenant abandons it or surrenders it, or if you go through the eviction process. You can't just change the locks or cut the utilities unless the unit's been abandoned, surrendered, or you've gone through the eviction process. And if you do unlawfully take possession of a unit that has not been surrendered or abandoned, or you've gone through the eviction process, the tenants can sue you and recover 3 months rent plus their attorney's fees, and it's likely they're also going to recover the value of any personal property that was lost or damaged in the process. So it's highly important that we get this process right, that we make good decisions here. And so we got to start off with this idea of abandonment, because that's what everyone asks about. So when has a tenant abandoned a unit? Okay, are you ready? Here's the answer. I have no idea. Okay, I like to shoot it to you straight, and I tell you when I don't know an answer. And I don't know when a tenant's abandoned a unit because we don't have an established definition of abandonment in Kentucky. So as a result, it makes it pretty risky to rely on the idea that a tenant has abandoned a unit. And to illustrate, let's look at some scenarios. So scenario number one, you've got a unit that's full of furniture, but the rent hasn't been paid, and you find out that the utilities have been disconnected. Has that unit been abandoned? No. Definitely not. Okay, it's still full of furniture. Okay, the tenant could easily show up and say, look, I was late on my utility bill and my utilities got disconnected. Why'd you change my locks? Now I'm going to sue you and recover 3 months rent. Thanks. So that's definitely not abandoned. But let's look at scenario number two. You have a unit that's pretty much empty. There's just some small or broken pieces of furniture around, some trash. Has that unit been abandoned? There's not much in there. Most of you might be inclined to say, yeah, there's not much in there. They've abandoned the unit. They're gone. Well, those tenants could easily show back up later and say, look, we got robbed. When we left, we went on a trip, went on vacation. Our unit was full of our stuff. Now we've come back and there's nothing in there. Our locks have been changed, and you're the last person we know is in our unit. So not only are we going to sue you for unlawful ouster, we're going to file criminal charges against you for stealing our stuff. That's not a good scenario. So it would not be a good idea to claim abandonment in that situation. But let's add some additional factors here. Scenario number three, we've got the same unit. It's largely empty, just some small broken pieces of furniture, some trash, but the utilities are also cut off. Has that unit been abandoned? Again, hard to say, but probably not, because the tenants, again, could show back up, say that they'd been on a trip, and perhaps they'd been late on their electric bill and it had been shut off, but that they'd left the unit full of furniture and they had intended to come back to it, and now you've unlawfully ousted them. But let's add another layer. In this scenario, you've got the same unit that is mostly empty, rent's unpaid, the utilities have been cut off, and the neighbors saw them loading their stuff into a U-Haul and take off. Is that an abandonment? Probably so. Okay, the neighbor's observations would undercut any claim by the tenants that they were, just on vacation and had been robbed and that type of thing. And so what you'd want to do, if you choose to rely on that as an abandonment, you would want to get a written statement from the neighbors about what they saw in case those tenants show back up later, okay, and claim that you'd unlawfully ousted them. So the more elements that you have present that indicate the tenants are gone and are not coming back, the stronger your case is, and the more likely a court would find that the tenants had abandoned the unit and that you had not unlawfully ousted them if the tenants show back up. So I think it's likely that the last case is going to be ruled by the court as an abandonment, but it's still not a slam dunk case. Okay, the neighbors might simply be mistaken. Okay, there's lots of research out there on eyewitness testimony, and people they don't always see what they said they've seen or what they think they've seen. So the neighbors could just be mistaken. It was the wrong unit that was loading stuff into the U-Haul, or the neighbors could just be lying. They don't like those folks, and so they just lied to you. Or maybe there was a U-Haul and the tenants were actually just moving a few things out to put it into storage because they bought new furniture or something like that. So it's a good case, but it's not a slam dunk case. And as a result, I don't like to rely on abandonment. And so my advice is always to go through the eviction process unless the tenant surrenders the unit. And so that just changes the question, what constitutes a surrender? And the answer is that a tenant surrenders a unit by communicating to you that the unit is now yours, that they've returned it to you. And that communication from the tenant can happen in different ways, but the two most reliable are that the tenant returns all of the keys or gives you a statement in writing that the unit is now yours. Now, that statement shouldn't be a promise to leave. It should be a statement that I'm gone, this unit's yours. Okay, signed by the tenant, dated, that type of thing. So let's look at some scenarios about surrender, because that's not always as clear-cut as we'd like it to be. So in this scenario, the first scenario, you've got an empty unit and you go in and the keys are on the counter. Has that unit been surrendered? Well, I'd say probably. That tenant could show back up and say that the keys had been stolen and that they'd been robbed. That's unlikely. That's not likely to be a winning argument. But anytime you don't have a direct communication from the tenant, such as a returning of the keys by the tenant, then there's some risk there for you. So when you find keys on the counter of the unit, that's a safer scenario than just finding an empty unit. But my advice is still go through the eviction process unless the tenant returns the keys. Let's look at the next scenario. You've got a situation where rent has not been paid and you find the tenant's keys in the drop box. You enter the unit and it's still full of stuff. Has that unit been surrendered? I'd say probably not, because you've got a tenant who hasn't paid the rent. Somebody might have just found his keys lying around somewhere, didn't know whose they were, and stuck them in the drop box. Okay, you don't know who put those keys in the drop box, so it's hard to say that the tenant surrendered the unit. So I would go through the eviction process in that case. Let's change it a little bit. You've got the same situation in that rent has not been paid, but this time the tenant's mother brings you the keys and says, you can have the unit. You enter the unit and it's empty. Has that unit been surrendered? Well, it probably has, but this time, because the keys weren't returned by the tenant, they were returned by someone who doesn't have authority to surrender the unit. So unless the mother had power of attorney for the tenant, or unless you had a written statement that the mother had the authority to surrender the keys, you'd want to follow up with the tenant on that one and see if you could get something in writing from the tenant that says, yes, I've surrendered this unit. Otherwise, you might want to go through the eviction process there. And then let's look at one last scenario. you've got a situation where rent has not been paid, you issue the termination notice, and one of the tenants, roommate A, brings you the keys and says, I've moved out, here's my keys. You go in the unit is empty, but roommate B, the other tenant on the lease, has not returned his keys. What do you think there? Has that unit been surrendered? Well, for roommate A, it definitely has. You don't need to evict that guy. He's gone. But for roommate B, no. He could easily show up later and say, look, my roommate stole all my stuff while I was gone on a trip. He was supposed to have paid the rent. I gave him my half of the rent. And if he didn't pay it, it's because he stole my money, and now it looks like he's stolen all my stuff. But I never surrendered that unit to you. And so to help me recover my losses, I'm going to sue you for 3 months rent, my attorney's fees, and the loss of all my stuff. So you kind of get the sense of how these things can go sideways pretty quickly. And so my advice is always you need to be very cautious in how you deal with these cases. You always want to be safe rather than sorry. You always want to figure out the worst case scenario and figure out how to avoid it. So my advice is always that the best practice is to proceed with the eviction process unless you have a clear statement of surrender from all the tenants, which means that they have returned their keys to you or stated in writing that the unit is now yours. Again, not a promise to move out, not a promise to surrender at some date in the future, but a statement that the tenant is now yours. Hope you've enjoyed the video. As always, if you need help, contact your friendly neighborhood attorney. You guys have a great rest of your week.